Hello and welcome back to What's Your History, the podcast that covers all areas of history and archaeology, no matter how big or how small, how well known or how niche. Today's guest was Dr Murry Tremellen, who has a PhD in the history of art, and his topic today was about James Wyatt, who was a British architect between the 18th and 19th century. It was a very interesting topic, as I didn't know much about this architect, though I have seen some of his work in passing. So I do hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Murray, what is it about James and his architecture that got you interested in him?
Okay, I first kind of discovered Wyatt during my BA in Southampton about 10, 12 years ago now. I was doing a module about Georgian country house history with Professor Dana Arnold, who's a very well-respected historian of the social history of country houses. And we were looking at the period 1750 to about 1840. And we looked at a lot of the big, well-known names of that era, names like Robert Adam, Sir William Chambers, and then the name of James Wyatt came up. And I realised that slightly less had been written about him compared to the Adam brothers. I became interested in the rivalry that had existed between Adam and the Wyatt brothers. And then many years later, after I'd been out of academia for a few years, I'd been working for the National Trust for about 5 years, but I was looking for a bit of a change of direction. And then I had the opportunity to start work on a funded PhD about the old Speaker's House at the Palace of Westminster, for which Wyatt was the architect. And when I saw that the University of York was advertising for a candidate to take that on, I thought, oh yes, Wyatt. I remember that man. He was very interesting. I'd love to research a little bit more about him. So that's really how I ended up going down this little research rabbit hole, if you like.
Nothing wrong with that. We like little rabbit holes. So you are now currently based in Yorkshire. Is there any of his stuff up here?
Not a lot in Yorkshire itself, actually. He did design Ripon Town Hall. I'm sure he designed at least one country house in Yorkshire, although I've forgotten the name of it. Yes, he was a very prolific architect. He had, I think, more than 100 country houses were either new build or remodeled in some way by him. But yes, strangely, Yorkshire is a bit of a lacuna. Scotland is another one. He never did a lot of work in Scotland, which was mostly because his rivals, the Adam brothers, were Scottish, so they did quite well at defending that market. But yes, throughout most of England and also in Ireland, he did a lot of work in Ireland. He didn't really do it personally. What he did was supplied designs which local architects could then execute on the spot. But yes, throughout England and Ireland, he was very prolific.
And as he was a rival to these other gentlemen, what was it about his style of architecture that makes him stand out to you?
A few things. As I've just alluded to, in his early years, there was a particular rivalry between him and Robert Adam. Now, Robert Adam is quite rightly recognised as the inventor, if you like, of what is now called the Adam style, which is a particular variant of neoclassical architecture, which is quite sort of elegant, chaste. I hesitate to use gendered terms, but quite feminine. It's quite associated with sort of garlands and swags and that kind of sort of moulded decoration, usually in fairly sort of low relief. So yes, it's a very sort of decorative version of neoclassicism. Neoclassicism itself is a particular kind of variant of classicism. There are several different variants of classicism. Classicism, of course, derives from the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. Earlier in the 18th century, you have what's called the Palladian movement, which is a very sort of strict and historically accurate revival of classical forms. Later in the 18th century, you get neoclassicism, which is more kind of inventive and creative. It's sort of adapting classical forms in a more original way. So that's kind of the architectural context that Wyatt comes into when he returns from his studies in Italy in the early 1770s. But what I think sets Wyatt apart from Adam, he's sometimes accused of having plagiarized Adam's style, but I don't think that's really fair. He did work in a similar style because Adam had made that style fashionable, and if he hadn't picked up that style, no one would have wanted to employ him. But there is a subtle difference if you get to know their buildings. Adam's style is, as I said, highly elaborate. Wyatt's is just a little bit more restrained, just a tiny bit more minimalist. The decoration is not quite so profuse as it is with Adam. Personally, I think it's actually better for that, and I think some other architectural critics agree, but of course, these things are subjective. Everyone has their own opinion. The other thing I think that really sets Wyatt apart is that in his later career, he never gives up on classical architecture completely, but he does become increasingly interested in Gothic architecture. Again, he's certainly not the only architect who's doing Gothic at that time, but I think he is probably the leading Gothic architect of his day, and he's probably the figure most associated with the Gothic style at the end of the 18th century. And I think he is particularly inventive in the way that he sort of adapts Gothic forms to suit the prevailing fashion for picturesque aesthetics, and generally to suit kind of late 18th, early 19th century fashion. So those are, I think, other things that really sets him apart.
Brilliant. So I want to ask you a bit about his background. Like, what is it that got him into architecture and stuff like that? Was he from a wealthy background? Or did he have a decent education? What was it that inspired him to go down this route of architecture, if you know it?
Okay. He came from a family who were sort of moderately prosperous. I guess today we would probably call them middle class, although I'm not sure, in all honesty, whether the Georgians would have used that term. They were, a farming family who had kind of diversified into building. And I think either 2 or 3 of Wyatt's older brothers also go into the building trade. Particularly his brother Samuel is also sort of renowned as a builder. Repton actually called him the best builder in England. But Wyatt, I think if I remember correctly, I'm right in saying he was the youngest son of the family of about 6 sons. And he, from quite an early age, as I say, unfortunately, the details of his early life are a bit sort of scanty, but it seems that from a fairly early age, he showed a talent for architectural drawing. And his family recognised this, and they were well connected enough that they managed to get him an opportunity to go to Italy. He's actually taken there by the secretary of the British ambassador to Venice, who's going to Italy in, I think, the mid to late 1760s, if I remember correctly. He spends 2 years in Venice and then another 4 years in Rome. And this is really important because, the Georgians, of course, almost idolized the culture of ancient Greece and Rome. For any sort of educated gentleman, doing the grand tour of Italy was a really integral part of their education. And so for any architect who, really wanted to make a success of themselves in this field, having the opportunity to go to Italy and study the great classical buildings firsthand was, really important. The other aspect of this, of course, is that I mean, firstly, it gives him the opportunity to meet great Italian artists, including Piranesi, who's, a very famous sort of 18th century Italian artist. And apparently he and Wyatt became, quite close friends during Wyatt's time in Rome.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But more importantly than that, of course, as I say, all those Georgian gentlemen are doing their grand tour in Italy. So Wyatt, while he's there, he has the opportunity to kind of get himself in their faces, make those connections, which then ensures that when he comes back to Britain in the early 1770s, he's got the connections ready so that he can start to canvass for work, if you see what I mean. Although, frankly, he hardly needs to, because almost as soon as he comes back to Britain, he gets a commission to design a building called the Pantheon, which it's not an accurate replica of the original Roman Pantheon. It's an assembly room in London, and it's actually modelled on the Hagia Sophia in what was then Constantinople, now Istanbul. But of course, Wyatt sort of takes the plan and then sort of reimagines it with sort of neoclassical decoration and so on. Now, at the time, the sort of the Middle East was maybe less likely to be visited by grand tourists. It was maybe a slightly less well-known prototype. Wyatt, I think I'm right in saying, didn't go there himself. This was something he must have become aware of through his education in Italy. But anyway, he designs this assembly room, and it's stunning, and it's an absolute sensation. Everybody loves it. And Wyatt almost overnight, displaces the Adam brothers and becomes the most fashionable and popular and sought after architect in England. And from that point on, he is deluged with more work than he can actually handle, which in a way is why his career eventually goes wrong.
Out of 3 different buildings, can you explain his career? As you said, that his career unfortunately does end up falling apart by the end of it. Would there be a way to be able to say the different phases of his life, his different phases of his career through the buildings he's done?
Yes, I think we could do that. So let's start by thinking about one of his neoclassical buildings, and Heaton Hall is quite a good example of his neoclassical architecture. In fact, that was his very first country house project. It's a country house. Nowadays, it's on the outskirts of Manchester. Obviously, because the city's expanded, it would have been slightly further away from the city in those days. And it's built actually at pretty much the same time the Pantheon is finished, which shows you just how good he was at being able to make those connections and get those contracts. As I say, it's a beautiful neoclassical mansion. The exterior is quite austere. That's often the case with Wyatt's buildings, both classical and Gothic. There's various reasons for that. I think partly it was a sort of personal preference, but also he said later in his life that he was very concerned about adapting sort of very elaborate classical ornamentation to the British climate. Obviously, classical architecture was designed for the much drier climate of the Mediterranean, and he was worried that, here in Britain, when it was exposed to rain and frost, it would be more vulnerable to damage. So where he did use decoration on the exterior of a building, he tended to make it very flat to sort of reduce that risk of damage. But when you get inside, it is very, as I say, it's not rich, it's quite sort of chaste, but it is very elaborate. There's beautiful ceilings with sort of garland decoration and little roundel paintings by an artist called Biagio Rebecca, who I think I'm right in saying was an Italian immigrant, and they sort of collaborated together regularly for many years. The staircase is what's called an imperial plan staircase, which means that you have a single flight of stairs going from the bottom up to the half landing, and then it divides into 2, which go back in the opposite direction to get up to the top. That was his favourite type of staircase, and he used it in as many houses as he could. But sometimes, of course, it wasn't possible because of, space restrictions or whatever. And it's got beautiful scagliola columns, scagliola being a type of sort of imitation marble. You could get it in various different colours. The ones at Heaton are a lovely sort of dark red colour. Unfortunately, you perhaps don't quite get the full effect of what Wyatt intended at Heaton, because like the Adam brothers, Wyatt tended to design his big houses as a complete ensemble. So he didn't just design the building, he designed all the furniture as well. Sadly, all the furniture at Heaton was sold off in about 1900 or so. And again, a lot of the rooms have been repainted. Some of them have had sort of gilding applied in various places, which again, Wyatt probably wouldn't have used in his interior work at this stage. Later on, his classical architecture does become a bit sort of richer and grander, but at this stage, it's more sort of elegant and chaste. But it's certainly a very beautiful building. At this stage, though, I think it's still quite traditionally classical in its plan. The rooms are still laid out all on a sort of long, straight axis. You're not really seeing that sort of irregularity and variety, which is, what art historians call picturesque. And later on in his career, Wyatt very much embraces the picturesque. And I think really the ultimate example of that is Fonthill Abbey, which is probably the most famous of his Gothic houses.
Okay.
Now, Fonthill is built near Salisbury, if I remember correctly, in Wiltshire. And it is built for a slightly eccentric gentleman called William Beckford, who is a very interesting character in his own right, actually. Like so many of these 18th century aristocrats, he had a fortune which ultimately derived from sugar plantations in the Caribbean, worked by enslaved people. On the other hand, Beckford himself was a victim of prejudice and discrimination because he was bisexual. He fairly early in his life was involved in a scandal which basically saw him ostracized from public life for the rest of his life. So yes, a very sort of interesting and complex character. But, whatever we may think of him from a sort of moral point of view, he was a great connoisseur and a great patron of the arts. And Fonthill Abbey was his sort of great architectural project. And he wants Wyatt to build it because he knows that Wyatt is the only person who can really kind of realize the kind of vision he has in mind. The trouble is, this vision keeps evolving and getting bigger and bigger over the course of the project. Beckford is almost a kind of megalomaniac. And, the Abbey is originally supposed to be just a sort of like a little folly in the grounds. And eventually it becomes this enormous, monstrous mansion. But it is very inventive. It has an enormous tower at its centre, a sort of octagonal tower, modelled on the octagon of Ely Cathedral, which was one of Wyatt's favourite Gothic prototypes. And then around this tower, you've got a sort of cross plan, and it's all designed around these sort of axial vistas. At one end, there's a little chapel dedicated to St. Anthony, and it's all very carefully thought out so that there are sort of very dramatic lighting effects to kind of give the effect of how the Georgians might have imagined that going into a medieval monastery might be. It's all very sort of dark and gloomy and dramatic, and but then you also have, off to one side, a sort of smaller and slightly more comfortable and modern suite of private apartments, which is where Beckford actually lives. The proportions of the finished building do end up a little bit odd. Some bits of it are sort of much taller than others. And again, that's because of the sort of haphazard way in which the design evolves. But nevertheless, it does look very dramatic and very picturesque from certain angles. And it does really capture the imagination of people in that era. And it really, does help to cement Wyatt's reputation as a Gothic architect. Unfortunately, it also reveals a lot of the more negative traits of Wyatt's character. as I've just alluded to, Wyatt always tended to take on more work than he could actually do. And as a result, he wasn't always there on site actually supervising the building process as closely as he should have been. Also, a lot of his clients, wealthy though they are actually spending beyond their means on these big architectural projects, and often corners are cut in the construction. Fonthill Abbey is, it looks stunning, but it's extremely flimsy. And after only about 25 years, this great tower at the centre of it collapses. And takes most of the rest of the building with it. And that, I think, is partly why Wyatt's reputation has suffered in the way that it has, because a lot of his best work, for various reasons, just doesn't survive. To be honest, I think those two examples are actually sufficient to kind of show the breadth of Wyatt's work and kind of the progress of his career.
Wow, I definitely feel like I need to go and see these places.
Well, as I say, sadly, you can't see Fonthill anymore because most of it's not there anymore. But yes, Heaton is still, sadly, it's not open to the public, 5 days a week. It's mostly used as a sort of events and exhibitions venue now. But there are occasional guided tours, and I do recommend it if you get the chance.
I'll do that at some point. Did he do any other forms of design? Did he do like gardens or anything like that, or is it just buildings focused?
Not so much gardens. He did collaborate with some of the great garden designers of his day, particularly Humphrey Repton, who you may have heard of. Certainly, if you've heard of Capability Brown, Repton is kind of like the next great landscape architect after Capability Brown. And again, he's very much a believer in picturesque aesthetics. So he's a perfect sort of foil to Wyatt in that respect. They worked together on a few projects, including the Speaker's House, which, as I mentioned, was the subject of my PhD. Repton did the garden there. Unfortunately, though, Wyatt, as I've mentioned, he's overworked, but he's also extremely disorganized. I think in a way, the fact that he did become so successful at such a young age means that he didn't spend as much time as he should have done working in the shadow of other architects and kind of learning from them and their kind of organizational strategies. And I think he never really manages to master the art of actually organizing his own office. And he's a total scatterbrain. Don't get me wrong, he is... He's certainly not lazy. He is capable of absolutely intense bursts of work, to the exclusion of everything else. But of course, in a way, that then creates more problems to him further down the line, because people will be trying to send him letters, trying to get hold of him, and he'll be saying, no, I can't think about those. I'm focused on this project at the moment. And then, of course, he has a whole queue of other unhappy clients waiting for him. Anyway, because of this
but isn't that a good thing that he focuses on individual projects rather than everything at once?
You might think so. The trouble is, where he really comes unstuck is towards the end of his career when, in 1794 to be precise, King George III, who inevitably he has come to the attention of the king because he's so prominent as an architect, and when Sir William Chambers dies, King George III appoints Wyatt to the very prestigious office of Surveyor General of the King's Works. And this basically makes him the top architect in the United Kingdom. He is, the King's personal architect, in effect. This is a post which has previously been held by the likes of Christopher Wren and Inigo Jones. It's a very great honour. But the trouble is, it's actually mostly not a design role. It is mostly an administrative role. It's mostly responsible for, organising all the routine repairs to all the royal palaces, to the Houses of Parliament, to various prisons, and so on and so on. And Wyatt largely neglects these duties because, he'd rather go off and go down to Fonthill and do some more work for Beckford because that's just more fun. And this becomes a major problem when boring but important things like passing the Office of Works accounts has to be done. And there are sort of all kinds of stories of, there are minutes in the official minutes of the Office of Works saying, we couldn't get hold of the Surveyor General. We've sent a letter to his house. We've sent a letter to 3 country houses where he might be working at the moment. But there are delays of sort of months in getting these vital accounts passed. And in the end, it transpires that actually, because he hasn't been paying enough attention to them, there's an awful lot of mistakes in these accounts. And at the very end of his career, the Treasury actually start investigating him. And in a way, it's actually very fortuitous that he dies when he does. He dies suddenly in a carriage accident in 1813. Just a few months later, the Treasury published this absolutely damning report, which, totally destroys his professional reputation. They also insist that because he's been neglecting his duties at the Office of Works, his widow has to repay all the commission that he earned as Surveyor General. And this basically completely bankrupts her. It leaves her penniless. So yes, a very sad end to what had started as a very distinguished career.
Blimey. It's a shame that being focused has ultimately become his downfall.
Well, yes, and I think, obviously, I'm certainly not trying to diagnose him with any kind of condition here, because I think you just can't posthumously diagnose people with various conditions, especially when they lived that long ago. But I think when we think about modern day workplaces and the kind of adaptations we make in the workplace to cater for people with various forms of neurodiversity, like ADHD and so on, I think Wyatt's story is quite it's definitely food for thought, because there are some people who do just work in that way. They it's quite a common trait in autistic people as well to have those periods of intense concentration on certain tasks or certain subjects, and it can be very difficult to get those people to focus on anything else. And even today, I think maybe some employers aren't as conscious as they should be of making adaptations for that. Now, of course, there was less awareness of those things in Wyatt's time, and even if there had been, of course, he was effectively, obviously, he was employed at the Office of Works, but he was a self-employed professional in his own practice. So, in a sense, you could say he really has only himself to blame for his own disorganisation. But nevertheless, I think it is food for thought.
Yeah, it really is. So you said that you were asked to do a PhD on the top Speaker's house down at Westminster Abbey, I'm assuming? Not Westminster Abbey, sorry. Westminster Palace. What can you tell us about that? Are you able to tell me about your PhD and what you did?
Absolutely, yes. So the Speaker's house is, or was, a very interesting building, and Wyatt's interventions are really only one part of a much longer story. Obviously, there has been a royal palace at Westminster since medieval times. During the Tudor era, the royal family move out, and the palace is then turned over, for the use of the 2 Houses of Parliament. But there are also various government departments that are based there, one of which is the Exchequer, which is basically the forerunner of the modern Treasury. Now, there have always been various people living on site at Westminster, various sort of housekeeping staff, but also various office holders. And for a long time, one of the people who lived on site was the auditor of the Exchequer. Now, he actually had a house effectively built for him around the old cloisters of St. Stephen's College. Now, again, just to give you the context here, St. Stephen's College is it's not like a modern day college in the sense of being an educational establishment. This is more like a monastic foundation. It's not monastic, but it's a religious institution. And it's based within the grounds of the old palace. Like all the monasteries, Henry VIII dissolves it. St. Stephen's Chapel then becomes the old House of Commons, but there's also a set of cloisters next to it, a very beautiful Tudor set of cloisters in what we call the perpendicular Gothic style, which is a sort of late variant of Gothic. And as I say, the Auditor of the Exchequer has his own mansion built around these cloisters. Now, in 1794, those cloisters get taken over by the Speaker of the House of Commons. He basically boots the Auditor out because he doesn't really need the House by this point. And this then becomes the Speaker's house. It is the official residence of the Speaker of the House of Commons. Now, the early history of the speakership is kind of like so many parliamentary traditions. It's kind of lost in the mists of time. It's hard to say exactly when certain traditions start, but I think it's fair to say that the role has been sort of steadily growing in stature over the years. And in the 1790s, there's a fairly sort of ambitious up and coming speaker called Henry Addington, who's quite sort of, I think, quite keen to use the role to make a name for himself. So he, I suspect, probably persuades his good friend, Pitt the Younger, who is then Prime Minister, to let him have this official house to sort of further aggrandise his status. In 1801, Addington becomes Prime Minister, which would never happen now. Nowadays, we expect the speakership to be the last job of a political career. But Pitt suddenly resigns, and the king rather likes Addington, and he's quite well respected. So the king asks Addington to take over as Prime Minister. Addington, after a few shenanigans, eventually appoints his own friend and protege called Charles Abbott to the speakership. And Abbott is another sort of quite ambitious man. He almost immediately tells the Treasury, the Speaker's house has terrible problems with damp. We have absolutely no choice but to demolish most of it and build it afresh. And it so happens that, the relevant secretary at the Treasury is Henry Addington's younger brother. So, of course, he's not going to argue with this. So Abbott is then allowed to have the Speaker's house completely rebuilt. And because Wyatt is the Surveyor General of the King's Works, he's already been doing various works at Westminster, although that's another story. So he's asked to take on this rebuild of the Speaker's house. And he does this in, his Gothic style. He decides to do all his work at Westminster in a Gothic style to sort of complement the existing buildings. And that's definitely one of the features which I think makes this project most interesting. For most of the 18th century, classical is very much sort of the default choice for major public building projects. The Gothic revival is sort of slowly starting to gain traction, particularly from the mid-century, but it's still regarded with a little bit of suspicion in some quarters, partly because some people still associate Gothic architecture with the sort of pre-Reformation Catholic Church, and there's obviously still quite a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice at this time. But also just generally because of that whole legacy of the Renaissance and that desire to sort of revive classical values. Most people in the 18th century really believe that classical values are a sign of good taste. And anybody who kind of deviates from that taste is viewed with a bit of suspicion. So Wyatt is actually really breaking the mould when he goes to King George III and says, I know we need some works done at Westminster, and I think it would be a really good idea to do this in Gothic style to complement the surviving medieval buildings on the site and celebrate the kind of medieval heritage of Westminster and the medieval tradition of the British monarchy, which is ultimately your monarchy, Your Majesty. And George III, he has previously been fairly conventional in his views on architecture. He's, previously his architect was Sir William Chambers, who was another great classical architect, but Wyatt successfully persuades him to switch to Gothic. And as well as his work at Westminster, he also does a big restoration project at Windsor Castle. He builds a brand new Gothic castle for George III at Kew, which sadly is never finished, but again, that's a whole story in itself. The trouble is, Wyatt's work at Westminster tends to get a bad press among historians for various reasons. partly because, like Fonthill Abbey, the quality of the actual work is quite flimsy, which again is probably just because Wyatt isn't there on site as much as he should have been to actually supervise things. He also gets into a lot of trouble with his work at the House of Commons. So just to kind of backtrack a little bit, just before he's asked to rebuild the Speaker's House, he's also been asked to enlarge both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Now, this is because the Act of Union, the Second Act of Union, is passed in 1800. So England and Scotland have been united in 1707. The 1800 Act of Union is now the Act of Union between Great Britain and Ireland. That means that 100 Irish MPs will now be joining the English and Scottish MPs at Westminster. St Stephen's Chapel just isn't big enough for all of them. Now, Christopher Wren had previously done some work on the House of Commons in the 1690s. He'd already added galleries in to accommodate the Scottish MPs. So the capacity of this building has already basically been pushed to its maximum. And Wyatt is only allowed a few months to get this work done before the first meeting of the enlarged Parliament in 1801. So Wyatt decides that the only solution to this problem is to literally make the walls of the chapel a bit thinner. Now, they're good, thick medieval walls. They're about 3 feet thick. So what he does is he sort of carves niches into them, and he puts extra sort of columns and lintels in to take the extra weight. So from a structural point of view, this is all fine. The problem is when they start work and take off Christopher Wren's wooden panelling, they find a beautiful and very well preserved series of medieval wall paintings from the days when St Stephen's actually was a chapel. Now, as I say, Wyatt is up against a tight deadline and probably up against a very tight budget as well. So it's difficult to say how he really felt about it, because he never leaves a great deal of writings about anything. Sadly, his office archive is dispersed after his death, so we don't have as much source material for Wyatt as we do for other architects. I suspect he was actually quite reluctant, but anyway, he destroys these beautiful medieval wall paintings in order to fulfill his brief and deliver the enlarged House of Commons that his clients have asked for. And, yes, it's deeply regrettable, but we have to remember he is a professional architect and his first priority is always going to be keeping his clients happy. However, there is an emerging architectural conservation movement in Britain at this time. Architectural conservation is still a bit of a new idea in the late 18th century, but there are architectural conservationists about. And as you can imagine, they are absolutely furious at this. And one of them in particular, John Carter, writes a really, really angry series of articles in the Gentleman's Magazine, not just complaining about the House of Commons, I might add. Wyatt also does various alterations at Salisbury and Durham cathedrals, which are also very controversial. But Westminster is definitely one of the big bones of contention. And I think the trouble is, because, as I've just alluded to, Wyatt hasn't left us a great deal of source material, historians have tended to look at Carter's account and kind of take that at face value, and they haven't really stopped to consider Wyatt's side of the story and sort of dig a little bit deeper and ask, okay, well, yes, he did do these destructive things, but why? Maybe there was actually a reason for it. So, as I say, yes, his works at Westminster are very contentious. They've tended to have a very bad press. But what my PhD was trying to do was sort of trying to take this work a little bit more seriously and say, okay, maybe the execution of this wasn't perfect, but actually that doesn't mean that the underlying vision shouldn't be taken seriously. And as I've just alluded to, I think the fact that Wyatt is, successfully persuading the king to use Gothic for this major building project, that is actually a really important landmark in the progress of the Gothic revival. And in a very real sense, I think that paves the way for the second big reconstruction of the Palace of Westminster, which comes after the big fire in 1834, and which gives us the modern Houses of Parliament, which we know now. That, of course, is famously a great Gothic building, but I doubt that would ever have been created had it not been for Wyatt's earlier work.
Blimey. So you are basically his cheerleader, trying to make sure that everybody knows that he is not as bad as it seems to be.
Well, I mean, firstly, I think it's important to say I'm certainly not Wyatt's only cheerleader. I think there has been generally a sort of a slow rehabilitation of his reputation, building pace over the last few decades. John Martin Robinson, in particular, wrote a very good monograph on him about sort of 10 years ago. And that, I think, did a lot to rehabilitate his reputation. I think it's also important to say that, I'm trying to rehabilitate his reputation as an artist and an architect. I'm certainly not trying to gloss over his personal failings, because I acknowledge that he was, in many ways, a deeply flawed personality. I've already alluded to, his mismanagement of the Office of Works, which I think we should remember. He's mismanaging serious amounts of taxpayers' money at a time of very real economic hardship for a lot of people. Because, of course, we've got to remember that the 1790s, 1800s, this is precisely when the Napoleonic Wars are going on. And that does pose a lot of economic challenges for people at the time, just in the same way that the war in Ukraine is posing challenges for a lot of people now. So I think we do have to keep that in mind. The other thing, of course, is his personal life, particularly towards the end of his life, does become a little bit seedy, quite frankly. There's a wonderful quote, I can't for the life of me remember who originally said it, but he said that towards the end of his life, Wyatt, if he could find a bottle and a fireside, he wanted nothing else. He was starting to drink a lot, his physical and mental health was declining, he was spending quite a lot of time with, shall we say, ladies of doubtful reputation. So, yes, again, a rather sad end to, what had previously been a very distinguished, if I acknowledge, slightly disorganized and chaotic life. So as I say, it's about trying to give him the credit that he's due for his artistic achievement, but not present some kind of hagiography which glosses over all his failings.
And out of all the buildings that may be still standing, I'm assuming you've gone and visited a fair few of these for your research purposes.
Not as many as you might think, actually. And again, sadly, that was partly because, of course, my PhD started just as COVID was kicking off. So that sort of limited my opportunity to visit places, but also just because, sadly, a lot of Wyatt's best buildings don't survive. And those that do, actually, a lot of them are not open to the public. Heaveningham Hall in Suffolk is one of his best surviving classical buildings, but that's sadly not open. Ashridge is one of his best surviving Gothic buildings. The grounds are open, and I have been to the grounds and admired it from the outside, and it is magnificent. But sadly, I haven't yet managed to get inside the house. And in any case, I think the interiors have been quite heavily altered. So, and the same at Heaton Hall, as I've alluded to earlier. So even where these buildings do exist, you're not necessarily getting the full impression that Wyatt would have intended. That definitely does make it harder to study Wyatt as an architectural historian. And I think that is definitely one of the reasons why his work has been relatively neglected. But yes, there are definitely Wyatt works still surviving. Appledurkham House on the Isle of Wight is one that I've been to. Sadly, that one is now just a ruin, but it does make a very picturesque ruin. I think if Wyatt could have seen it, I think he would have, probably not actually been displeased with its appearance as a ruin. I think he would have said, "Oh yes, this is a very good picturesque ruin right here." But yes, so as I say, not as much sort of first-hand contact as I would have liked. And also, it must be said, actually, for the Speaker's House, there wasn't as much archival material surviving as I would have liked, particularly images. Strangely, there are very few images of the interior of Wyatt's Speaker's House. There's a couple of beautiful watercolours of the staircase he built for the Speaker's House. They're at the Museum of London now, but that is pretty much it. And you're just left to try to piece it together from inventory descriptions of the furniture, which again are not always very precise, and from what we know of Wyatt's other work. But yes, certainly I think enough survives in terms of surviving buildings and surviving documentation to show that he was a great architect, and I think he deserves his reputation as a great architect.
Well, it's definitely going to be perking some people's ears up now, because I'm sure many people, even if they don't know much about him, they've probably heard his name in passing. Because even I don't do architectural history myself, but even I've like heard the name every now and again with certain buildings. So I think to anybody who's listening to this, they might go hunting for some of the places.
I hope so. I'd be glad if they did.
Well, I'm definitely going to do it as well. So yeah, thank you for all this. This has been a really fascinating talk. Is there anything else you feel that needs to be said about Wyatt and his history or his any work and stuff before we close this?
Not particularly, actually. I suppose one thing that's worth mentioning is one Wyatt building that may actually be very familiar to listeners is Belvoir Castle in Rutland. Again, this is one that sadly I haven't yet had the pleasure of visiting in person, although it's very much on my list. But if anybody has watched The Crown, Belvoir Castle is the location that they used as a double for Windsor Castle. And I think it is definitely one of Wyatt's most inventive and picturesque Gothic compositions. Sadly, again, it burnt down even before it was finished, I think I'm right in saying. And his sons then actually redid a lot of the interiors. So again, it's not a pure James Wyatt building, but yes, it's definitely one to be aware of. I think the other thing that's perhaps worth mentioning as well is Wyatt is very much one member of a dynasty. The Wyatt family is huge, and an awful lot of them become builders or architects or artists or craftsmen. So I've already mentioned Wyatt's older brother Samuel, who's the great builder. I think it's also worth mentioning Wyatt's sons, Benjamin Dean Wyatt and Philip Wyatt. Benjamin Dean is quite a fairly distinguished architect in his own right. He remodelled Apsley House for the Duke of Wellington, which still survives, and you can see the interiors there, and they're well worth seeing. He also did, was it Drury Lane Theatre? Oh, I can't remember now. Philip Wyatt was also, inherited a lot of his father's talent. He remodelled Conishead Priory in a Gothic style, just as well as any of his father's work. Unfortunately, he was, if anything, even more feckless than his father. Eventually, he gets so badly into debt that he goes bankrupt, and he actually drags his older brother into bankruptcy as well. So, yes, the story of the Wyatt dynasty is not always a happy one, but, Oh, and again, I haven't even mentioned Wyatt's nephew, Sir Geoffrey Wyattville. I briefly alluded to the restoration work James Wyatt did at Windsor Castle. After his work, Geoffrey Wyatt, his nephew, does another round of alterations at Windsor Castle for George IV. For his pains, he is knighted and allowed to change his name from Wyatt to Wyattville. So George IV held him in quite high regard. So yes, the Wyatt dynasty, John Martin Robinson, called them the Wyatt dynasty, and they truly were a dynasty. To give you some idea of just how prolific they were, when Howard Colvin wrote his famous Dictionary of British Architects, he actually includes an entire page with the Wyatt family tree on it, because there are so many of them and they're so important. So yes, it's well worth being aware of that context, but yeah, James Wyatt was definitely the standout, the one who absolutely made it to the top of his profession as Surveyor General, even if he then largely squandered that opportunity. Yeah, and I think they all deserve to be better known. Of course, I would say that because my PhD is my pet subject, but come on, I think I've made the case here.
And out of the buildings that you have gone and visited, what would you say is your favourite so far?
Ooh, I am going to say Ashridge on balance, just because obviously, having done my work at the Speaker's House, my affinity tends to be more with the Gothic stuff. And Ashridge, I mean, it was his last major building project. And things were definitely starting to go wrong for him by this point, but it shows that even in the midst of all his personal troubles and the financial troubles, he was still a brilliant designer, and Ashridge is as good as anything else he designed. But having said that, as I say, I haven't yet had the chance to go and see Beaver, so maybe I'll just reserve judgment until I've had the chance to go and see that one, and then maybe we can compare.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for this. Where can people find your work or you if they want to reach out to you or learn anything else?
Okay, well, my thesis is available open access through White Rose eThesis if anybody really wants to plough through the whole thing. I am hoping to publish various sort of articles based on my work in the near future. So, hopefully more news on that in due course. I do also have my own Instagram, Twitter, YouTube channel. I'm on YouTube and Instagram as @Architecture of Politics. I'm on Twitter as @mtremellen. I'm always delighted if people reach out to me. As you can probably tell, I love discussing Wyatt and all his work. So yeah, anything you want to know, just drop me a line. I will do my best to help.
Fantastic stuff. I will make sure to put all his information down in the description as well, so you can go check out his stuff, especially his YouTube channel. He does a lot of very interesting things on there, and I think you did a video to do with the latest house, the Ashridge house.
Coming soon. It's on its way soon.
Coming soon, so you can check out that as well. So thank you, Murray, for taking part in this and telling me all about James Wyatt. It's not something I knew much about, and now I feel like I need to know more. So clearly we've got a lot of adventures to come up with in the future.
Not at all. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Murray for being on this podcast with me today, and thank you to all my guests that have appeared on What's Your History so far for this half of the season. We're going to take a short break now. I will be back again with more guests in June, so please stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, if you would like to revisit some of my older episodes, they are down below, and I hope you enjoy. So thank you to all my listeners. Thank you for everybody who has subscribed, liked, shared, even commented on my content, no matter where you've seen it, either here on Audible or Spotify or even YouTube. Thank you so much. It means so much to me. So thank you to everybody, and I will see you again in June.